Welcome to the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative Technical Webinar. We're conducting a series of these webinars, so watch your inbox for details about upcoming sessions. If you follow the ADL Initiative on social media, we'll be posting topics there as well as recordings on YouTube. If you know anyone else who would like to be on our distribution list for these webinars, please feel free to have them reach out to us and we can add them to the list. Today's technical webinar is about user-tailored privacy. Our speaker is Bart Knijnenburg, an assistant professor in human-centered computing at Clemson University. Bart will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and there will be time at the end for him to address your questions. He will try his best to get to as many questions as possible within the allotted time. To ask a question, you can click on the questions panel in the GoToWebinar window and type your question there. This webinar will be recorded, and we will distribute a YouTube link via email in case you would like to share it with your colleagues. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker. Take it away, Bart.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks everyone for joining this webinar, and welcome to the first of two webinars on user-tailored privacy. So today I will talk about user-tailored privacy, which is a novel means of protecting users' privacy. And there will be another webinar next week where we will look specifically at how user-tailored privacy can be implemented for distributed learning systems like the Total Learning Architecture, TLA. So if you're interested in that, if you're interested in going a little bit more into the roots on implementation, then please make sure to put that webinar on your calendar as well. Liz has already introduced me. My name is Bart Knijnenburg. I'm an assistant professor in human-centered computing at Clemson University. My research interests are in usable privacy decision support and user-centric design and evaluation of adaptive systems. And the idea of user-tailored privacy nicely falls on the dividing line between those two different topics. So I'm really excited to be speaking about this today. I also have in the room with me two students, Darisha and Reza, and so they will be answering any questions that you may have throughout the talk. Anything they don't answer, I'm happy to try and answer after the talk or over email if you wish. So before I go any further, I want to acknowledge the gracious support that I've received from a DoD award from the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative. But at the same time, I want to tell you that the views expressed in this webinar are the views of myself, and they don't necessarily represent the views or policies of ADL or the Department of Defense. So today I will give you an introduction of the idea of user-tailored privacy and explain how it can serve as a model to alleviate the privacy concerns of users of complex information systems. This webinar is, and the one next week are based on a comprehensive report on user-tailored privacy that I wrote for ADL. And you can find this report as well as all kinds of other information on this general project of privacy for TLA on this website over here. I will also make sure that the video and the slides of the webinars are available through that same link as well, although they will also be distributed by ADL. All right, so I know that y'all are very busy, so I want to give you a one-slide takeaway of user-tailored privacy in case you need to drop out at any point during this webinar. So just the one-slide takeaway here is that the idea behind implementing user-tailored privacy in an information system is to measure users' privacy preferences through their characteristics and behaviors, to create a model of those preferences using machine learning techniques, and then to adapt the privacy settings of the system that you build this into according to this model. And so the reason for doing this is that it strikes a balance between giving users no control at all over their privacy, which is obviously bad, and giving them full control over their privacy, which in modern information systems that are rather complex in their privacy settings is also not a good idea, because giving users full control, as you will see later in this webinar, actually overloads them a significant amount. So UTP strikes a balance here. That's kind of the overall goal of what we try to do. So I will go through, today I will go through the following topics. First, I will make a case for user-tailored privacy and try to convince you why this is important. I will give a definition of user-tailored privacy and kind of give you a framework for understanding how UTP works and what kind of applications it has. Then I will talk about the 3 different components of user-tailored privacy separately, and these are measuring privacy, modeling privacy, and then adapting privacy. So I will go over all these things. This week I will focus most on the first 2 topics, and next week I will go much more into detail on the latter 3 topics. So first, let me try to convince you why you should adopt the concept of user-tailored privacy in the information system that you are working on. So I'm assuming here that many of you who are listening are software engineers or managers who are working on systems or managing systems that require user data for their operation. So these are systems that could be social media, they could be recommender systems, HR systems, CRM, learning and training systems. As an engineer of these systems, if you are an engineer, you are probably familiar with technical solutions for privacy protection. So this includes privacy-preserving software architectures, algorithms, and encryption techniques. Now, I want to acknowledge the value of these techniques, and I want to say that it's very important to implement these techniques, but they are not the final solution to all of your users' privacy problems. First of all, they have inherent drawbacks to themselves. Distributed architectures, for instance, are a little bit limited in that as the data is distributed over multiple parties, there needs to be a lot of exchange of data, which is slow and can in itself be vulnerable. Client-side personalization, leaving all the data on the client and never sending it to the server at all, sounds like a good idea, but can be vulnerable to data loss or theft. Providing anonymity or pseudonymity is another way to avoid privacy problems, but it is very difficult to guarantee anonymity, especially since modern data sets, modern machine learning techniques can re-identify users in sufficiently rich data sets. And also in many information systems, it's actually desirable to know who the user is. And learning and training is one obvious example of this, where for credentialing, you need to know who the user is. So you need to have their identity at some point. You can try and encrypt all the data in your system, but this can be very slow, and not all encryption is equally trustworthy. Encryption is only as good as the time it takes to develop a new attack method, right? And then finally, privacy-preserving technologies can help protect data from a security standpoint, but privacy is often also a social aspect. So especially if you have a system where users interact with each other and where they share information with each other, these solutions don't really apply to the concept of protecting your data from being spread too widely among other people. So another point here, kind of more generally, is that if your goal is for users to disclose the information that is needed to optimally run your system while not increasing their privacy concerns, then implementing these privacy-preserving technologies is a good starting point, but it's definitely not sufficient, because it doesn't guarantee that users will feel more protected and subsequently disclose more information. As an example of this, we did a study where we asked people to disclose their information to a app recommender system, and we told different users different scenarios about where their data would end up. So some users were told that their data would end up at a company called American Personalization. Others would be told that their data would be collected and used client-side, so not shared with anyone. Other users would be told that the company behind the system was Amazon. And others were told that the data would be sent to the cloud and processed there without really telling them who the entity was behind that cloud-based system. So what we find, we look at both people with low privacy concerns, general privacy concerns, GPC low, and people with high general privacy concerns, GPC high. And what we find is that people with low privacy concerns, they do not trust client-side personalization that much. In fact, they trust Amazon, a quote-unquote reputable company, more than keeping the data on their own phones. They think that Amazon is better at protecting their privacy than their own phone would be. They're definitely not happy with cloud either. Now, if you go to people with high privacy concerns, client-side personalization fares a little better, but even people with high privacy concerns feel equally protected if Amazon manages their data, which is interesting. Only when you start looking beyond privacy protection to more generally the privacy concerns that they have in these different scenarios, it shows that people with high privacy concerns tend to be somewhat less concerned with client-side personalization. But as you can see from these graphs, it's not very obvious that all users would automatically appreciate a privacy-enhancing technology like client-side personalization. So the takeaway here is that if you want users to feel comfortable enough to disclose their information, you need to complement these technical solutions with user-centric ones. And so a good way to do this is to use the philosophy of privacy by design. So although most system developers tend to deal with privacy, especially users' privacy perceptions and concerns kind of at the end of the development cycle, the idea behind privacy by design is to build privacy principles right into the core of an information system. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time today to go into a lot of detail on privacy by design because this webinar is about user-tailored privacy. But last year, I did organize a webinar on privacy by design. So at this link, you will find YouTube links and slides of those webinars. So if you're interested in privacy by design, I definitely encourage you to check out those links. So even though privacy by design is really great, and I really think you should check out those webinars, it does have its own inherent limitation. And the reason behind this limitation is that most of today's information systems require a certain amount of information, a certain amount of disclosure from their users to provide their functionality. So no matter how well you build privacy into the core of the system, in the end, there's still an inherent trade-off between privacy and system functionality. And so on top of that, one of the best documented findings in privacy research is that people tend to differ in how they view this trade-off. So some people are inherently more private than others, and people even tend to differ to what extent they feel private about different types of information and different types of disclosure. So different people have different concerns regarding their information, and when this information is a trade-off, that results in some variability. And so to deal with that variability, it is necessary to provide users some form of privacy settings where they can kind of navigate this trade-off between benefits and between functionality and privacy to a level that makes them comfortable themselves. And so this means that you need to allow users to manage their privacy through some sort of privacy controls, and also to give them sufficient information to help them operate those controls. And so these principles are embedded in the well-known privacy philosophy of notice and choice, which you may have heard of. Now, I'm not saying that notice and choice is inherently bad, but the concept of notice and choice has been shown to be very problematic in complex modern information systems. And there's many researchers who have shown severe shortcomings of this paradigm. For instance, because the privacy implications of these modern systems are usually very complex, providing sufficient information about what actually happens with your data, etc., results in really complex privacy policies and FAQs. And even when they are well designed, privacy notices tend to be kind of fickle and fleeting. It turns out that if you make people read a privacy policy or a piece of privacy information, usually the effect of reading that information is gone after about a minute. Likewise, users of information systems tend to say that they want to take control over their privacy, but when you give them control, when you give them settings, frighteningly few users actually take control and actually change their settings. And because of that, giving users control can actually lead to misplaced confidence, because giving users control that they subsequently don't exploit means that they are not actually in control of their data, and they don't know actually what is going on with their privacy. And even when people make decisions about their privacy, it turns out that their decisions are not always very rational. And so all of these points make me argue that notice and choice are they're good, but they're kind of unrealistic in modern systems, because those modern systems are just too complex. To drive this point home, here you see the state of privacy in Facebook. On the left, you see an overview of Facebook's privacy settings, which there are currently over 200 privacy settings kind of spread across the interface. And so it's very difficult for people to really be aware of all these different settings, let alone use all of them. On the right, we have the evolution of Facebook's privacy policy. This ends in 2010, when the policy was more than 5,800 words, which is longer than the US Constitution. So it's unrealistic to believe that people will actually understand that people will actually be fully aware of and understand that information. Now, to underscore the point about users' lack of rational decision making, there have been some very interesting findings in industry of kind of unexpected privacy behavior, so to say. So here at the top, you see an example of two different shipping forms. So you fill out this information to ship a product to you. And so this is a crucial point in the conversion of an e-commerce website. And you see here that version A has a trustee logo, which is supposed to inspire trust in users. But it turns out that showing that logo actually reduces the conversion rate of that website. So it's very interesting, it's unexpected. Likewise, here at the bottom, you have 4 different ways in which a user can be asked to sign up for newsletters. And so if you show different users different versions of this question, so these are 4 different versions, and if you show these to different users, they end up disclosing to a significantly different extent, even though the question in essence is exactly the same. So if you ask them, please send me newsletters with an unchecked checkbox, their disclosure in this particular study ended up being 25% of people said yes. The second one, please do not send me newsletters, 37% of users ended up with a newsletter. The third one, where please send me newsletters, was already checked, 53%. And the last one, where please do not send me newsletters, was already checked, 0%. So even though this question is exactly the same, there's huge differences in how people make that decision. So here's where user-tailored privacy can provide a clear advantage. So if the problem is that modern systems are too complex to just give users all the control and all the information, user-tailored privacy offloads some of this burden of privacy decision-making by selectively automating some of the privacy settings and selectively giving users notice and choice over those parts of the privacy settings that are actually relevant to them. So that way, making these privacy settings becomes much more manageable for the user. Now, there's another privacy paradigm that tries to do away with the concept of notice and choice, which is called privacy nudging. And so the idea behind this approach is to use the fact that people's privacy decisions can be influenced by external factors, like the way a decision is phrased, to create what we call a decision environment in which people are nudged to make the right privacy decisions more easily. Now, unfortunately, these privacy nudges have been shown to not really work for everyone to the same extent. And this makes sense because, as I mentioned earlier, most information systems have this inherent trade-off between privacy and functionality, and people differ in how they feel about this trade-off. So it's difficult to decide or to argue what is the right amount of disclosure, what is the right amount of information that people should share with the system. This differs per person. So a system that nudges people into either disclosing more or less may actually kind of challenge their or threaten their autonomy. Again, this is a point where user-tailored privacy fares better because it provides a solution where it automates part of the decision-making process, but it does so based on a personalized model of the user's privacy preferences. So effectively, it moves the idea of nudges beyond a one-size-fits-all approach to something that is more user-tailored. So to summarize, compared to notice and choice, user-tailored privacy reduces the burden of privacy decision-making. And compared to privacy nudging, it respects the individual and the contextual differences that are inherent in people's privacy preferences. And another benefit here is that if you have a system that has an organizational perspective, or that's used in organizational settings, then it allows the system to not only factor in the user's own personal privacy preferences, but also the constraints and practices of the organization. All right. So I hope I have convinced you of the benefit of user-tailored privacy. And now you're probably wondering, how does it all work, right? So let's delve a little deeper into what user-tailored privacy is and what it does. So I'd like to start explanations of user-tailored privacy with this schematic overview. As you can see, it kind of models user-tailored privacy as a typical three-component user adaptive system. The first component gathers input, and so the idea is that it measures users' privacy preferences by observing their characteristics and their privacy-related behaviors. The second component here models these privacy preferences in a context-relevant manner. And so context is important throughout this model because privacy preferences may depend on what data is being requested, who is receiving that information, and in what context is this information being requested, right? So because these preferences differ by context, that context needs to be part of the model. And so once the model is established, this first component over here then makes supportive adjustments to the system. So it may change the privacy settings directly or give users recommendations, potentially with an appropriate justification for changing certain, for them to change certain settings themselves. But the idea is to basically adapt, to provide some adaptive decision support. All right. So within this model, there are several flavors of user-tailored privacy support that one can consider. The most obvious one is tailored automation. So in this version of user-tailored privacy, the system measures the user's privacy preferences and then automatically acts kind of on their behalf, adapting the privacy settings according to those preferences. So it really automates the process of privacy decision-making. Now, the idea is that this automation kind of happens outside of the user's awareness. And while that can be a benefit because it reduces the burden of privacy decision-making, it also creates a risk of disengagement and of a potential lack of transparency. So because of that, you can also implement what I call tailored awareness. So the idea here is to not just automate the privacy decisions, but also to try and model and figure out where the user actually has a high stake in the privacy decision. And at those points to inform them about the decisions that the system makes on their behalf. In that case, if the decision is wrong, they can always go in and change things or adjust if needed. Now you can take this a little further in the direction of tailored guidance. And so in this case, the system doesn't make a decision for the user, but rather it guides them into a direction. So it guides their privacy decision making that they do themselves. This can be done through nudges or through adaptive interfaces, for instance. So this is useful because research has shown that different users care about different privacy aspects, different aspects of their privacy controls that are available in the system. So with tailored guidance, the system can kind of highlight those privacy settings that users actually care about, and that way it enables them to take control over those aspects without being overloaded with control. And so to take this one other step further, a final goal of user-tailored privacy would be to eventually, in the long run, educate users about their privacy so that they are eventually empowered to truly understand and, in effect, control how their privacy is being impacted by the system. Now, tailored education is just another form of privacy education, but beyond traditional privacy education, tailored education is more efficient because it tailors the education to whatever the user's level of knowledge and interest is. So we will only teach the user privacy practices about things that they don't yet know about and that they would potentially be interested in. So the final ultimate goal of user-tailored privacy is to find a perfect balance between automation and user awareness and involvement. So implementing user-tailored privacy in your system does not mean that you have to pick one of these flavors that I just talked about, but rather to implement all of them and choose wisely which one to use when. So this may depend on the importance of the decision, right? So if a decision is more important, then more impactful, then maybe the user should be kept more in the loop than when a decision is rather inconsequential. It can also depend on the confidence that the system has in its prediction. If the system already knows 99% sure that the user will make a certain setting, that can be a setting that can be automated. Whereas if they are less confident, they can ask the user. And it can also be based on the user's own preference. As I mentioned, people have different preferences for what kind of privacy settings they wish to engage in. And so we can give them control over those settings that they want to take manual control over and offload some of the control over the parts that they don't really care about themselves. So now I will take you through the different aspects of the user-tailored privacy framework, measuring, modeling, and adapting privacy. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I will give only a high-level overview of these different components. The next week's webinar will go into more detail, specifically regarding how to implement these different components in distributed learning systems like the TLA. But for now, let's give you an overview and start with the concept of measuring privacy. Now, if there's one thing important in measuring privacy that you should definitely keep in mind, it's the fact that context really matters, right? I've said this before, but the challenge here is really to compile an overview of the context in which the privacy decision is made. Observing a privacy decision is easy. Understanding the context in which it is made is more difficult. So this includes both the type of information that is being requested, who is the requester, as well as the social technical situation in which the disclosure takes place. Now, an important guiding principle here is to decompose privacy decisions into its core components of threats and benefits. As I said before, in modern information systems, disclosing information always has a benefit for the system, makes the system work better in most cases, but it also leads to some privacy concerns. And research shows that to a certain extent, people trade off these risks and benefits in what they call the privacy calculus. So it may help to measure these antecedents of the calculus, to measure these risks and benefits beyond just measuring the outcome of the decision itself. So an important antecedent of privacy calculus is the type of information that is being requested. And of particular interest here is whether the information makes the user uniquely identifiable. That's obviously more sensitive. What is the overall sensitivity of the information itself? And to what extent can other information be inferred from the disclosed information? And that latter point is extremely important in modern information systems, because recent advances in machine learning allow sensitive data as well as the user's identity sometimes to be inferred from what is seemingly innocuous data sets. So it means that you shouldn't just take the data at face value when deciding whether it's sensitive or not. Another component that I mentioned before here is that users' decisions are prone to these external influences, like how the information is being requested, etc. And so if you want to know how the user's decision is impacted by relevant things like the type of information, you need to try and factor out the irrelevant components, like how that information is being requested. So that's a little tricky, but it's an important aspect here. Another important factor to consider is who are the other actors involved in the privacy decision. So this includes the recipients of the information, but it could also be other actors involved that, for instance, co-own the information, right? So who are those actors, and how do people deal with the other parties that are involved in the decision? Now, it turns out that research shows that people form multiple boundaries between themselves and others, and they tend to differ in the extent to which they defend these boundaries. So if you are building user-tailored privacy into kind of a social media setting where users directly interact with each other, user-tailored privacy has to support these different strategies for privacy boundary management, these different ways in which people open up themselves and close themselves to others. Also, if you have an information system where information is collectively owned, then user-tailored privacy must consider and try to reconcile the privacy preferences of all the stakeholders involved. And again, it is possible that they have different ideas and different preferences for reconciling this information. So here's an example of these different privacy boundary management strategies that people have. This is an example of a piece of research that we did specifically on Facebook, where we found that users can be characterized using 6 different profiles. We have a group of privacy maximizers who engage in almost all of these different privacy management strategies, as well as minimalists who don't really engage in much privacy protection. But aside from that, we have qualitatively different strategies, such as selective sharers, who tend to share a lot of information, but they're very careful in deciding who gets to see which information. On the other hand, you have these self-censors who disclose very little information, but whatever they disclose broadly to whomever wants to listen to it, essentially. We also have time savers consumers. They focus not so much on what they disclose, but rather on the incoming information, which is also part of privacy concerns, the right to be left alone and the right to not to be disturbed, right? So they focus more on that side of social media management, so to say. And then there's privacy balancers who do a little bit of everything. So important to know here is that different people really have very different approaches in which they deal with social privacy boundaries. And so this needs to be taken into account. A third component of privacy decision making that user-tailored privacy should take into account is the social setting as a whole. So this requires to view disclosure not just as a binary, but as a gradual decision. So it's technically true that once information is disclosed, you can rarely really take it back. But in most real-world cases, the social space in which the information is disclosed and the accessibility of the space by others really makes a huge difference in how private people think that disclosure, or how private or public people think that disclosure is. So it's important to note that the social setting really also transcends the physical location, right? It's really the meaning of the situation rather than the specific physical space. So user data privacy should try to infer the social meaning of a situation from a disclosure behavior in order to understand the significance of the disclosure. Again, difficult thing to do, but it's an important thing to take into account. So one way to do this is to try and find out what the norms and values are that apply in that particular setting. So these are useful not only for privacy modeling, but also if you want to give users a justification for a certain recommendation, appealing to the norms and values of the situation is usually a good justification. It's important to note, though, that norms and values are culture specific. In fact, we did some studies where we showed that taking culture into account when you are modeling privacy really improves the accuracy of user-tailored privacy modeling. Also, the introduction of a new information system or a new type of technology altogether can change the existing norms and values that exist in a space. So you really need to take into account the fact that existing norms and values may not hold once your information system is in place. So this leads to the consideration of the technical domain as well, in which the privacy decision takes place. So the design and the affordances and the expectations of privacy really differ substantially between different technologies, right? So the way we think about privacy with social media versus Internet of Things versus fitness tracking, there's a whole different set of expectations that people have. And so because those ground rules tend to differ between these different settings, in fact, if you have a novel technology, usually it generates a whole new class of data that is being collected, right? So this kind of seems to grow exponentially over time. But because of these differences between different types of technologies, it is also unfortunately the case that user-tailored privacy kind of needs to be reimagined for every new technology that is being developed. So unfortunately, there's no universal user-tailored privacy module that I can recommend you build that will work for any possible system. You probably have to redevelop this for different types of systems, depending on what technological fields you work in. Likewise, the design and implementation of a specific system also really influences people's privacy decisions. And so this is why I mentioned earlier that it's really important to also consider the privacy by design approach as a complementary approach to user-tailored privacy. And another point is that when we disclose information online, we often don't really know what's going to happen with that data and when it will happen or whether anything bad will happen at all. So uncertainty is another thing that needs to be modeled here. People are influenced by that uncertainty when they make their decision. User-tailored privacy can try to take away some of that uncertainty through modeling. And it's also important to know that some of that uncertainty might arise from the fact that people's privacy preferences tend to change over time. So this doesn't only mean that privacy models from user-tailored privacy, the privacy models should evolve, but it also means that the current models may have to take into account potential future changes to people's preferences in order to minimize potential regret. So all in all, you should realize by now that measuring preferences is really hard, especially when you want to do it in an unobtrusive way. User-tailored privacy should try to get as much information as possible out of the observed behavior of the users in the information system, because you don't really want to interrupt the user while they are going about their use of the system for confirmation about certain privacy settings. Privacy is almost never the user's most important task. is usually a secondary task. So interruptions are bad unless it's really absolutely needed. So one way to get more information, to kind of squeeze more information about the user's actual information, is through a concept called process tracing. So the idea behind this is that rather than just observing the user's decision itself, is to also carefully examine the behavior that leads up to that decision. What information are they looking at? What are they considering, right? This means very detailed tracking, sometimes even of eye or mouse movements on a website. And if you want to do that, obviously, you also have to take into account the fact that this in itself can be seen as invasive. So paradoxically, that itself may be a privacy threat, right? So you have to be a little careful in to what extent you do that. So as mentioned before, privacy decisions are subject to these external influences. Privacy boundaries can change over time, especially as data is accumulated, right? And in group settings, there's all these kinds of interdependencies that can influence users' behaviors, right? How people interact with other people, how their preferences and behaviors influence the current user preferences and behaviors. And so it's really difficult. This really makes it difficult to get a clean measurement of the user's privacy preferences. And again, I hope that I've shown you in this section that even though it's difficult, it's not impossible. You just have to take all these things into account when you do it. And the more you take into account, the better. All right, so now we turn to modeling the user's privacy preferences based on this collected information. And so this section I've kept purposefully short for 3 reasons. One is because, like many machine learning settings, gathering good input data is much more important than state-of-the-art modeling. This is also true in user-tailored privacy. Another point is that general user modeling techniques that are available in machine learning are actually perfectly applicable to user-tailored privacy. And there's lots of resources out there on how to do machine learning. So I'm not going to cover that in this talk. And then finally, the particular modeling strategy that you want to follow, so if you really want to go into detail on how to do this, that really depends also on the domain. So I can go into detail on this, but I'll do that next week when we talk specifically about TLA. Right, one important aspect that I do want to mention when it comes to modeling is that I think it is important to make a distinction between modeling the user's knowledge and their preferences. Preferences are most commonly modeled in user-tailored privacy because they allow for tailored automation, right? If you know the user's preferences, you know what to adapt. But knowledge is also important, especially for tailored guidance and education, because that depends on also on what the user knows. Also, knowledge kind of helps distinguish between the rational and irrational elements of the user's privacy preferences, because the privacy aspects of which the user has little knowledge are usually also the ones that are most likely to fall prey to irrational influences. So as for algorithms, again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but the main distinction can be made between collaborative filtering on the one hand and case-based reasoning on the other hand. Collaborative filtering leverages similar other users' privacy settings to provide recommendations. And this is probably the most powerful technique. It's the most used technique in existing recommender system and adaptive systems. But it may in itself fall prey to privacy problems, because as you are using other people's preferences in your recommendations, some of those privacy preferences might leak through, so to say. So if privacy settings themselves can be considered as sensitive information, you have to take care of that as well. Now, case-based reasoning does not rely on other users. It's therefore also easily possible to use in offline situations or in client-side situations, but it is typically more static, and it means that the models that you create of the users don't really evolve over time or improve. All right, final thing that I want to mention about modeling is that in user-tailored privacy, the target of the model is not always very obvious. it seems obvious to try and match the user's current behavior, because if you match the user's current behavior, then you can alleviate some of those privacy behaviors. But it is also possible for user-tailored privacy to instead try and find behaviors that are complementary to the user's current behaviors, right? And so by recommending those behaviors, you can solidify the current privacy practices. And when we talk about education, it's actually important to find those privacy practices that the user currently doesn't engage in, to see if we can evolve their privacy behaviors beyond their current practices. All right. Now we come to a point where we use this model that we would create of users' privacy preferences to provide adaptive privacy decision support. And again, I will go into more detail on this in the next webinar and only give a brief overview here. So modeling or adapting privacy to the user can be done in several different ways. And the most straightforward way is to simply adapt the privacy settings themselves. And this can be done either automatically, where you literally take the user out of the loop, or through nudges, where you kind of tell the user to do one thing or another, but still have it do it themselves. As I've mentioned before, it's important to take the context into account when you make these kinds of adaptations. And it's also important to respect the user's autonomy. Another potential useful adaptation is to provide justifications for suggestions, for suggesting certain privacy settings or behaviors. So providing a justification can kind of increase the user's trust in the adaptive system. And so over time, it will make user-tailored privacy more effective. The idea of tailored justification, though, is to actually tailor that justification itself also to the user. And so the goal here is to find the optimal framing and the optimal timing of giving a certain suggestion and a certain justification for that suggestion. Then one can also adapt the privacy setting interface to the user's privacy preferences. So this combines the idea of user-tailored privacy with the concept of privacy by design. So again, the idea here is to acknowledge the fact that people kind of gravitate towards different aspects of privacy settings that they want to be more involved with. And so the goal is to emphasize those settings that are more likely to use, while de-emphasizing the ones that they're not interested in. And then finally, research has shown that users of personalized systems differ in how comfortable they are with the use of their data for personalization purposes. So if your system has any kind of personalization, as most systems nowadays actually do, then you can also tailor the personalization procedures to the user's preferences. So with all these adaptations, it's important to keep various ethical considerations in mind, right? So for example, when you're reconciling the goals of different stakeholders, which is one thing you can do, it is important to always keep the end users themselves at the core of the decision. And tracking users in a way that conflicts with their privacy preferences can actually be harmful. So in the long run, you really also don't want an over-reliance on automation and making users disengaged, because it's very easy for this to take the wrong turn. So in essence, I think that you need to just be very careful with user-tailored privacy. Make sure that people stay in the loop, because privacy adaptations themselves can be seen as intrusive, and any mistakes that you make can actually have severe consequences. So people really need to be on board with this. You can't just spring this on people. This has to be done in a user-involved way. So that makes me summarize this point, right? Where, or emphasize this point that I made in the beginning, where I said that, the goal of user-tailored privacy is not to replace the user's privacy decision-making, but rather to balance their control over their privacy settings with the burden of that this entails. So it means providing a balance between tailored automation, awareness, guidance, and education. All right, quickly some concluding remarks. It deserves to be stressed that the ultimate goal of user-tailored privacy is to empower users to make better privacy decisions. And so one way to do this is to automate any low-impact decisions, but at the same time to allow the user to take control when it matters to them. And so conceptually, the control that we give people should be provided in a language and level of abstraction that is more in the domain of the user, or kind of what matters to them, rather than the domain of the system. And so kind of reflecting on this concept of user-tailored privacy, I think that what it allows users to do is to move away from this quintessential concept of privacy settings and to really help users to think about their privacy goals and aspirations. That's really where we want to be in. So this means that we need to afford users a substantial amount of agency. We do not want to prevent users from making any privacy mistakes. People learn from their mistakes, right? So we really want to help them to avoid mistakes where possible and mitigate in other cases. So as such, it also means that user-tailored privacy should not, or at least not only be evaluated by the accuracy of its predictions. So this is not just a machine learning concept. This is a socio-technical system, and the evaluation should focus on how this system is able to avoid privacy problems and how it can empower users to take control over their privacy. And so much of this is best accomplished with a layered evaluation approach where each of the different components is evaluated separately. But one should also investigate the holistic impact of user-tailored privacy, including its potential negative externalities. And again, we really need to take a socio-technical perspective there. All right, so to repeat my one slide takeaway, today I've shown you user-tailored privacy as a novel means of protecting users' privacy. And I've demonstrated how user-tailored privacy consists of measurement, modeling, and adaptation. Hopefully, I've also convinced you that user-tailored privacy strikes a nice balance between giving users no control over their privacy and giving them full control, which tends to overload them. So if you're interested in learning more, I hope you will attend next week's webinar on user-tailored privacy for TLA. And in the meantime, I really encourage you to check out the website for this project, where we have lots of other related materials. I will now open the floor for questions. And if you have any additional questions, I know I went a little over time, but if there's more questions, then I'm also happy to answer those over email. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. And as a reminder for anybody listening and wants to ask a question, there's a panel that says questions. Just pop that panel out and type your question in there. I'll read off a couple of questions right now for you, Bart. First one is, how do we determine which aspects to include to model user privacy?
That's a difficult question. What I've been doing that really works is I've ran really big kind of almost conjoint analysis style scenario-based experiments. So the idea is, for instance, this was a problem for us when we started doing this for IoT, household IoT, smart home devices. We had no idea where to start and what to include. So what we did is we systematically generated thousands of scenarios where we manipulated which device is collecting the information, which device is using the information, what information is it collecting, what is it using the information for, how is the information being distributed, et cetera, et cetera. So we systematically vary these different components, and we run this giant experiment where we test these thousands of different scenarios with hundreds of users. This can very easily be done on Amazon Mechanical Turk, fortunately, because it's very simple. And then you just look at, you ask them, you give them a scenario, a specific scenario, and maybe you give each person that joins the study like 10 or 20 of them, and ask them specifically for that scenario, would you enable this? Would you be okay with this happening or not? And if you do this for all these 1,000 scenarios, you can then run a regression model to see, which components, which aspects that we manipulated have the strongest impact on their actual decision. So that allows us to see which components which are actually relevant, which do we have to take in mind, and which do actually not have a strong influence on their decisions, which we can safely ignore. Does that answer the question? I hope so.
Absolutely. All right, thanks. And then how about one more question? How can context help predicting user privacy behavior while the decision maker is the same person?
So, yeah, kind of in a similar vein. If I'm asked, let's say on a mobile phone, if Google Maps asks me to share my location, I guess I'm fine with that, because I kind of need that for Google Maps to actually work, right? But if I have a flashlight app on my phone, and that flashlight app asks me to share my location, I'll be like, why does it need my location, right? So it's the same user, it's me, but in these different, and it's even the same device and it's the same type of information, but just the app that is requesting the information is different, and I have different preferences. And so the app can result in a different preference. The piece of information can result in a different preference. But even when it is being asked, can result in different preferences. In some cases, people tend to prefer to give the information only at the point in time where it is needed, and not give all that information up front, for example. So this is how context tends to, subtly change how people how likely people are to accept these kind of privacy-related things. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Good.
Okay, that's it for the questions that we have today. But I did drop a link into the chat window in case anybody is interested in registering for the second part, the second webinar next week. And also, if you're looking for the link that's on the screen right now, that's also in the chat window.
Excellent.
All right. And thank you, Bart, so much. And thank you to your whole team for working on this webinar for us.
Well, thank you for hosting, and thanks everyone for listening, and I hope to see everyone again next week.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.